Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to recommend some books that you can read for the Trans Rights Readathon, or just because you're a person of taste who happens to enjoy trans books. In case you don't know, the Trans Rights Readathon is currently happening. It started on March 17th and it's going until March 31st. So if you're watching this video around the time it's posted, then there's still plenty of time to join in yourself. The Trans Rights Readathon is an annual decentralized call to action for readers and book lovers alike to rally in support of trans rights, especially in the run-up to Trans Day of Visibility, which happens every year on March 31st. The idea is to seek out books by and about trans, non-binary, two-spirit, and gender non-conforming characters and authors, but to also double your impact not just by reading and uplifting these books and authors, but also putting forth some kind of tangible action that supports trans rights. I will include some helpful links and information down below if you want to learn more, so definitely check that out. But there's also a bingo board for this round of the Trans Rights Readathon that includes 9 reading prompts, and I've compiled 2 book recs you can use for each of those prompts. Diving right in, the first prompt is non-binary and gender expansive rep with diverse bodies, and the first book that came to my mind was According to Plan by Kristen Randall. This book came out earlier this year, and the 2 main characters are both fat, non-binary, neurodivergent teenagers, so this definitely fits the brief. The story follows Mal, who was really excited for the beginning of their senior year, especially because after years of contributing to the school's literary magazine, they were finally named editor-in-chief. But when budget cuts shut down the magazine, Mal is suddenly left scrambling to find a new extracurricular activity that will look just as good on their college apps. But then one of their former staffers, Emerson, suggests that the staff goes rogue and creates a contraband zine instead. I've said it before, but both of Kristen's books so far have so much worthwhile to share about living at the intersection of neurodivergency, fatness, and queerness. And on top of that, this book is also a really warm, lovely celebration of counterculture and the value of building community spaces. I think it's also a love letter to young people in the sense that it's encouraging young readers to create things, to make art, to find beauty and value and purpose in whatever it is they choose to do in their own ways. And I love that so much. The other book I would recommend for this prompt is Sorrowland by River Solomon. This is a dark, twisted sci-fi horror story about Vern, who is 7 months pregnant with twins and desperate to escape the religious compound where she was raised, and that's why she decides to make a break for it and flee into the woods. There she gives birth to her children and raises them far from the influence of the outside world. But even having escaped, Vern is still very much being hunted, and after she digs deep to unleash an inhuman amount of brutality in order to keep her and her family safe, her body is racked by inexplicable, uncanny changes. This is an incredibly dark, graphic, fucked up book, but it's also stuck with me so profoundly ever since I read it back in 2022. It has so much to say about the horrific expectations and stigma that we project onto female and feminine aligned bodies, especially the ways that they change and transmute over time in ways that are deemed undesirable or unexpected. And it's also just a really powerful story about trying to liberate yourself in every sense of the word despite the odds and no matter what it might cost. The next prompt is a book about trans youth or that imagines trans futures, and I'm going to start by recommending The Transition by Logan Ashley Kisner. This came out towards the end of last year, and I haven't seen it receive nearly as much recognition as it should. It's a paranormal YA horror story about a 17-year-old trans boy named Hunter who recently got top surgery and is super excited to get back to school and finally look and feel like himself. But right before he returns, he becomes the victim of a wild animal attack that was so violent it very nearly claimed his life. Initially, he's just happy to have survived, but then he realizes that his injuries are not healing normally and his body might be slowly changing into that of a werewolf. This was hands down one of the best books I read last year. I found it to be a gritty, groundbreaking YA trans horror story that pulls no punches and isn't afraid to explore how transition can be and feel both beautiful and monstrous at the same time. I feel like it fits both sides of the brief where this prompt is concerned because it's very much about a young trans person fighting to exist and fighting to survive. And honestly, if you love like Andrew Joseph White's books, I feel like you'll also really enjoy this. As far as trans futures, I would suggest checking out Amplitudes, which is an anthology edited by Lee Mandello. The subtitle on this anthology is Stories of Queer and Trans Futurity, which I feel like speaks for itself. But this is a short story anthology that incorporates elements of sci-fi and speculative fiction to interrogate far-flung futuristic landscapes in an attempt to imagine what queer life can and will look like. I haven't read this one myself, but it sounds really promising, especially as far as fulfilling this prompt. I love weird, futuristic, queer and trans stories that reimagine the possibilities of what existence can look like, and this seems like a good resource for that, and also has the added benefit of potentially introducing the reader to a lot of new, exciting, up-and-coming queer and trans voices. Next, we have a trans plus book someone recommended to you, which obviously is quite subjective, but I'm going to get around that by recommending a book that was recommended to me me and then also sharing a book that I would personally recommend. The former is Dear Mothman by Robin Gao, which I'm pretty sure was recommended and reviewed very highly by my friend Beck. This is a middle grade verse novel about a young trans boy named Noah, whose best friend was also trans but tragically passed away in a car accident. They were both obsessed with cryptids, especially Mothman, which is why after Lewis's death, Noah starts writing letters to Mothman since he feels like both of them struggle to prove to the world in their own ways that they do in fact exist. He becomes so consumed by trying to prove to himself, his friends, and his family that Mothman is real that he actually decides to make Mothman the subject of his science fair project, again despite the fact that everyone thinks he's just messing around and wasting everyone's time. This was another one of my favorite books that I read last year. It's a beautiful, provocative, heart-wrenching story about trans kids having to navigate questions of what it means to be good enough, trans enough, and ultimately real enough for other people to take them seriously. It really does have so much to offer, and I'm really grateful that my trans friends loved it enough to share it and recommend it in their own content. A trans book I would personally recommend is a 2025 release called Best Woman by Rose Domu. This is a satirical, adult, coming-of-age story about a Jewish trans woman named Julia, whose family has actually been pretty supportive of her through her transition, and she's been able to maintain a really close relationship with her brother, who's about to get married. And they're so close that he's actually asked her to be his best woman. So against her better judgment, she leaves behind her very queer life in New York to spend a week down in Florida for the wedding. And not only will she have to have some very awkward conversations with extended family she hasn't seen in a very long time, but she also finds out that Kim Cameron, her former high school crush, is stepping in to be the maid of honor at the last possible minute. This is a bizarre, frenetic, uproarious trans coming-of-age story that I really enjoyed and that kind of took me by surprise in the best way. I found it to be a delightful and thoughtful story, pushing back against predominant trans narratives and stereotypes with nuance and showing a character who has the capacity to hold and honor so many different versions of herself, which ultimately makes her a better woman in the end. The next prompt is a book about trans elders or trans history, and I'm going to start with a book that's so easy to recommend for this, which is So Many Stars, An Oral History of Trans, Non-Binary, Genderqueer, and Two-Spirit People of Color by Quero de Robertes. This is exactly what it says on the tin. As part of a fellowship or grant program, the author spent an extensive amount of time interviewing trans elders of color from across the country, gathering their stories about their lives, how they grew up, how they discovered themselves, how they understand their place in the ongoing legacy of queer history, and so forth, and those interviews were then transcribed into this book. This is a truly extraordinary book. It's not often that we get to hear from so many trans elders in one place or in one medium, and I think the choice for this to be an oral history as opposed to narrative nonfiction or something that the author then restructured and edited into traditional nonfiction was so incredibly purposeful because it allows us to experience these stories as told in the subject's own words and own voices. It leaves you with so much to think about, and it feels like a gift handed down directly from older generations, which is a really powerful thing. Quick mention of The Other Olympians by Michael Waters, which is a truly incredible trans history book. If you haven't read it yet, you really need to read it. But besides that, I would also suggest checking out Before We Were Trans by Kit Hayam. This is a trans history book that illuminates the stories of people from across the world, ranging from antiquity to present day, whose experiences of gender have defied or existed beyond clear-cut binary categories. It's supposed to blend historical analysis with cultural criticism, and it's also written by an author who happens to be a trans historian and activist. Again, this is one I haven't yet read myself, but I've heard it's really remarkable, and for it to cover such wide swaths of history in less than 400 pages is both incredibly ambitious and also incredibly important, I think. I really love this next prompt, which is for a trans book featuring joy, love, or resistance. Personally, I think this first book does all three, and that's none other than Ander and Santi Were Here by Johnny Garzavilla. This is a queer Latina YA love story about a non-binary Mexican-American artist named Ander who wants to take a gap year before college to work on developing their portfolio. And in a strangely backhanded attempt to be supportive, they get fired from the family taqueria so they can have more time to work on their art. But at the same time, they also have to stay on and help train the new hire, who happens to be a super hot boy named Santi. There's so much that can and should be said about this book. Even though it came out a few years ago now, it unfortunately remains incredibly timely because it's engaging with pervasive issues that the Latina community has to navigate, especially where racism, xenophobia, and so-called immigration enforcement are concerned. But even though it's giving voice to those heavy topics, it's also joyful, full of so much life and so much love, and it's a triumphantly defiant story about two queer Mexican kids saving each other and fighting for each other in more ways than one. Leaning more towards the topic of trans joy and trans love, I would also recommend The Build a Boyfriend Project by Mason Deaver if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. This is an adult romance about a trans journalist named Eli Eli, who's been stuck working as an assistant at an online magazine when he really wants to be a feature writer, and he also happens to work under his ex. After one of his roommates sets him up on what turns out to be a truly disastrous first date with a handsome stranger, Eli finds himself venting about the date at the office the next day, and his boss happens to overhear and proposes that if Eli keeps dating this walking disaster, somehow helps him become boyfriend material, and writes an article about it, he might just get that promotion he so desperately wants. I've said it before, but I'll say it again. I absolutely love having Mason's incredible, beautiful, chaotic mind in the adult romance space. I love that they're writing these super fun, but also super thoughtful romances featuring and celebrating trans heroes. Personally, I think this story is able to strike a really great balance between showcasing a zany, fun, fake dating scheme and also exploring how difficult it is for queer and trans adults especially to find community and to find ease in living as themselves. For the next prompt, we have trans femme or trans woman rep with multiple trans characters. And the first book I'm going to recommend for this is one that I've talked about recently. That is This Wretched Beauty by Elle Grenier. This is a trans remix of The Picture of Dorian Gray that reimagines Dorian as a trans femme non-binary person. Dorian is the sole heir to their family estate, but in order to inherit it, they're forcibly estranged from their father and forced to live with their grandfather, who is incredibly controlling and abusive. One night, Dorian meets a talented young painter named Basil who invites them to sit for a portrait, and it's not until Dorian sees the incredible likeness Basil is somehow able to capture, a likeness that no one else has been able to see, that they become consumed by all the new, different possibilities for their life. This is truly extraordinary work. You might have heard me gushing about this book recently in my last wrap-up video. I think it's such an incredible reworking of Dorian Gray that takes an already queer blueprint and builds off of it in ways that are even bolder, even messier, even more queer and trans, and it's able to take the story to new and exciting places. Also, while this version of Dorian is trans femme non-binary, the love interest Basil is trans masc non-binary, and there's also other queer and trans characters that the pair run into as they cavort through London's underground scene of queer clubs and molly houses. So the story definitely fits the prompt in that sense. I would also suggest looking up Hot Girls with Balls by Benedict Nguyen. This is a story about Asian trans women as written by an Asian trans woman. It's a satirical sports novel about Six and Green, two Asian trans female athletes who are daring to go where no woman has gone before, the Men's Professional Indoor Volleyball League. Even though they are women and they're both presenting and living as women, they can only play professionally on the men's teams. And on top of navigating that tricky dynamic, the two of them also happen to be in a romantic relationship. So they're traveling all over the world playing indoor volleyball, they're on rival teams, they're trying to stay in touch with each other as partners, they're navigating being in the public eye, and right before they finally reunite for the championship tournament, they broadcast their relationship to fans during a live show online and are suddenly faced with a huge PR crisis. This sounds absolutely ridiculous, but also absolutely delightful in so many ways. There's a lot of interesting relationship dynamics and interpersonal dynamics that I think are going to be really fun for the story to explore, and overall I just think it sounds like a really worthwhile recent release. Next we have Trans Masc or Trans Man Rep written by a BIPOC author, and assuming you already know about and have read my fave, Cemetery Boys, I'm gonna skip over that and first recommend The 30 Names of Night by Zain Jokadar. This is a really extraordinary story about a closeted Syrian-American trans boy who is searching for his new name, and one night he enters an abandoned building in Little Syria and finds the tattered journal of a Syrian-American artist named Layla Z, who was both a visual artist and an ornithologist. She famously spent her life painting the birds of North America before mysteriously disappearing, and this journal might just contain proof that both Layla and the main character's mother both encountered the same rare bird right before their deaths. And with the journal, the main character also sees an opportunity to preserve his mother's legacy with this new evidence that might just complete her unfinished research. This is another really extraordinary book that works as an incredibly intimate character study of some very deeply realized characters. The story also really explores grief, not only in regards to the loss of the main character's mother, but also the fact that he's mourning the person he always thought he was meant to be and the person he no longer is. It's also a celebration of how naming something is assigning meaning to that thing, understanding where it belongs and where it fits into the rest of the world, and so getting to witness the main character discovering and naming his transness, his grief, and ultimately himself is a really powerful thing. A much more recent release that fits this prompt is Time Tripping Over You by Brennan Lane, which just recently came out on March 10th. I believe this is a YA contemporary sci-fi romance about a trans college freshman named Silas who is a scientific anomaly because he finds himself uncontrollably thrown back in time and forced back into his pre-transition body for hours or days at a time without warning, and then he's forced to relive random moments from his past. As an astrophysics major, he's really trying to figure out why this is happening to him, and just as he's about to accept that the situation is a one-of-a-kind phenomenon, he meets Jude, who seems to be experiencing the same symptoms. What's more, Jude claims he was visited by a future version of Silas who told him that they're meant to help each other if they want to put a stop to these so-called time trips. There's so much about this that speaks to me and deeply fascinates me. This was easily one of my most anticipated 2026 releases, and I'm so glad it's already out in the world so that you can read it for this prompt, or just because, if you so choose. The second to last prompt is for books containing Two-Spirit, Indigiqueer, and Indigenous gender expansive rep, and first I would recommend really anything by Joshua Whitehead, but specifically Full Metal Indigiqueer by Joshua Whitehead. This is actually a poetry collection and a really cool project, I think. Not only is this narrative poetry in the sense that it reads as a continuous story or narrative as told through poetry, but it's also using binary code and classic text to trace the formation of a colonized self and reclaim what it means to live and experience indigiqueerness. Like I said, this is a really cool creative project. If you're newer to poetry, I think narrative collections like this can be a great entry point. And like I said, this collection is doing really cool things by hacking into and unraveling colonized ideas of what it means to formulate identity and how these classic texts and canons contribute to the formation of self. Speaking of Joshua's work, he also edited a really great Two-Spirit anthology called Love After the End. This is an anthology of Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer speculative fiction featuring short stories written by Indigenous authors that feature Two-Spirit and queer heroes in both utopian and dystopian settings. This is said to be a sequel of sorts to a similar anthology project called Love Beyond Body, Space, and Time, edited by Hope Nicholson, but I think because they're both anthologies, they can both be read and enjoyed on their own. Sort of like what I said about Amplitudes, I think this is a great opportunity to read from new and lesser known queer and Two-Spirit Indigenous voices. And the last prompt is for intersectional trans plus rep outside of your own experience. Obviously, this is another deeply subjective prompt. I have no way of knowing which identities or intersectionalities you might hold for yourself. So for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to recommend books outside of my own experience, and if they also fall outside of your experience, then great. Starting with one of my forever faves, Felix Ever After by Casing Calendar. This is a top-tier queer white contemporary story following a black trans boy named Felix who's studying at an arts-focused high school, and he often thinks that because of his intersecting identities as someone who's queer and trans and black, that other people might see him as being too much work and therefore too hard to love. After someone at school publicly outs him, dead names him, and puts up photos of him pre-transition, he also starts getting anonymous transphobic messages online. And so he decides to create a fake Instagram account to try and catfish the anonymous catfisher back and get his revenge. This book is considered outside of my experience because I am not a black trans teenager or demi-boy or anything of that nature. But like I said, this is definitely one of my favorite books. It's messy, it's complicated, it's not clear-cut in any way, but it's an incredibly layered story about a trans boy who's been hurt by the world in so many ways and reacting to that in the only way he knows how. I really appreciate stories that allow their trans characters to make mistakes, to not be great people, to not know what they're doing, and to ultimately show that trans people, especially trans people with multiple marginalizations, are worthy not only of love, but worthy of second, third, fourth, fifth, infinite chances. And I feel like that's what this book is really about. Lastly, for today and for this prompt, I thought I would recommend Ray Stovey's latest release, which is called Worst Case Scenario. This is a queer enemies to lovers YA romance about a non-binary teenager named Sydney who only has two goals for their junior year. They want to become president of the school's Queer Alliance Club, and they want to keep their self-diagnosed anxiety in check so that their grades don't completely tank. But when the election results come back, the race actually ends in a tie, which means Sydney will have to temporarily share the presidency with their arch nemesis, Forrest, until a revote can be held at the end of term. And even though Sydney fully expects Forrest to be completely insufferable, it kind of turns out that working together might be nice. Again, speaking only for myself, this book falls outside of my experience because I don't share the main character's particular neurodivergencies, which I believe are anxiety and possibly OCD. So if you're looking for a trans book with neurodivergent rep, but this could also be a great choice if that also happens to fall outside of your experience. This book also just recently came out towards the end of January, so I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but Ray Stovey is an incredible author. You could read pretty much any of their books for this readathon, and I think any of them would make fantastic choices. So there you have it. Those are at least 18 books you could potentially read to fulfill any and all of the 2026 Trans Rights Readathon prompts. Of course, there are so many other possibilities besides the books I mentioned here. Also, these are not discrete recommendations. A lot of these books could fit into more than one prompt. But if you have any other ideas for books that fulfill these prompts, please feel free to share with the class down below in the comments. And before I go into the outro bit, I just wanted to end by gently reminding you to care about the trans people in your life, and even the trans people who are not in your life, because a lot of us are not doing okay. We could really use your support, your donations, your action. So whatever you're able to give in conjunction with this readathon, be it time, money, mutual aid, energy, action, I promise you it is very needed and it's very appreciated. With that said, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.